on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. Are you there? I don't know. If you're there and watching right now, please make sure to say hi, give us a wave. And throughout this conversation, please be part of the conversation. That's why we do these live, to give you the opportunity to ask questions, to share your own personal stories, to give us feedback with your own comments, etc. And you could do that from wherever you're viewing this, and hopefully we'll be able to see those and throw them up on the screen and address those questions and comments. We have been on a recess at the water cooler, and when it was time to bring it back for our summer season, I knew that I needed to have Sonya Henry. One day in class, she asked me, hey, if you ever get back to that water cooler thing, will you, like, could I maybe go on there maybe one day? And like, but the way she was saying it was like one day, 5 years from now. I'm like, no, like, I want you on now, especially because, as you'll see, Sonya is such a thoughtful speaker, and so she's just not like me, not the diary of the mouth type of personality. She actually processes and thinks and has so many incredible pearls of wisdom that I have no doubt will come up today. But no pressure, Sonya. I know that puts some pressure on you, and you're already feeling a little stressed. But I am so happy to have you here to share your personal story and your insights as an IO and as a professional within well-being. And we look forward to hearing from you. So let me give you Sonya's brief intro. Sonya Henry is the inaugural Associate Director of Wellbeing Programs at CWB, where she leads signature well-being initiatives that support student development and success. As a longtime higher education professional and career pivoter, Sonya has held various positions focusing on cross-cultural competence, student engagement, and program management. An emerging thought leader, her well-being philosophy is rooted in learning the science first, then making the practice an art to catalyze the individual transformation and collective liberation. I love that language. That's amazing. So, Sonya, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Same goes. So, but the one thing that I warned you about, and I know the most nerve-wracking part of this whole thing, is our 6 in 60 round. So you know the rules. I'm going to ask you 6 questions, and within that time of 60 seconds, you have 1 minute to answer all of the questions. Now, if you don't get them all answered in 60 seconds, the interview ends there, and we're done. No, I'm kidding. If you can get them done, I think you'll be like the third guest in the history of the water cooler to get it done. So no pressure. Right. But let's go ahead and hop into the 6 in 60. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. All right, Sonya, what is one thing that you would like to see stick around after this pandemic?
Personal space, respecting it.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm so jealous that in addition to all the roles you fill, you still make time to travel. How many countries have you visited, and what has been your favorite destination?
So it's been a while. I haven't traveled in a while. Last time I counted, it's 26.
Wow.
And my favorite destination, it's hard, but probably Lisbon.
Wow. That's amazing. 26 countries. That's amazing. When you're feeling overwhelmed or burned out, what do you do to reset and recharge?
Journal or a long hot bath. Sometimes together.
Right. Why not? As a career pivoter, what is one piece of advice you have for other people looking to change careers? And I know there are a lot of them during this great resignation.
To follow your the energy, the bliss of what's interesting to you at that moment.
Great. And could you give us one notable trait of your favorite boss of all time?
Genuine concern for me as a whole person.
So appropriate to the topic we're talking about. And finally, what is the meaning of life in 3 words or less? No pressure.
That's so hard. Um, to cultivate joy for self and others.
You are such a rule breaker. That was definitely more than 3 words, but we'll take to cultivate. But a lot of them were, what are those called? Connecting verbs or whatever? I
Yeah,
don't know.
articles,
Yeah, come on.
related.
So, so you made it through. Awesome. So, Sonya, could we start with, I really want to get into your origin story because that's so much a part of this, like where your personal journey and being able to sort of dissect that from the inside out. And I want to get to that. But I also feel like we can't just brush over what it means to be the associate director of well-being programs at the Center for the Advancement of Well-being. That's a mouthful. What exactly is it that you do?
Oh, it's the best job ever. So I'm new in this role. It's a new role, but essentially I design programs, events, learning experiences for college students to cultivate well being, all aspects of it. There's a lot of collaboration with campus partners to integrate well being activities into other student programs. And yeah, that's the shortest version of what that means. And I'm new, so it's evolving, but it's a exciting and fulfilling role.
Great. So it's evolving. So you say that you're the inaugural person in this role, right? So is there a lot of job crafting that goes into this?
Yes, there's certainly the opportunity to design programs based on my expertise and interest, as well as based on student feedback. So, what are the issues that current students are facing, and what programs and events can I create to support and address those interest or experiences. So there is a lot of crafting involved. And, part of it is also finding ways to support my colleagues, right? My fellow colleagues who are working with students. How can we ensure that we're taking care of ourselves in order to best support students?
Yeah, and I know from personal experience, and I know that you know from personal experience, it's hard being a student. During COVID, it made it extremely hard, and also so many students who are students and fully employed at the same time. That's incredibly difficult. So being able to reach those people and make a difference, I would think would be really rewarding and very challenging. But I wanted to ask you. So when I was titling this interview, I titled it with wellness, and you got back to me and said, "Can we use the word well-being?" And I know that I'm guilty of using those two terms almost interchangeably. And we talk about
Mhm.
wellness, well-being, burnout, mental health, mental wellness. These are all buzzwords, and anytime something becomes a buzzword, it seems like every organization, every team starts chasing these things, but without necessarily properly defining them first or understanding what it means generally and what it means to them,
Mhm.
which gets really sloppy, and then the programs sometimes don't work, right? So could you tell us a little bit about how you define well-being, and maybe in contrast to these other terms, but certainly what is well-being?
That's a great question. And I think my personal definition has evolved. When I first started learning about well being, I agreed like feeling good and doing good, the combination of both. But as I started to experience my own life and didn't really measure up in those traditional terms, I started to design my own definition of well being. So, right now, um, I define well being as the active pursuit of striking a positive balance in life. And so, what I mean by that is good and bad can coexist, but if you train your mind through a variety of practices and strategies, activities to focus on what's good and to just tip the scale ever, even if it's ever so slightly, you're doing well-being, right? You're cultivating that skill, and it's a ongoing process. Just linguistically, it's the ing symbolizes something that's ongoing. And so that active and continuous pursuit of that positive balance is how I would define it.
I love that idea of the ing, that it's an active process. So this isn't something that we can just eventually move far enough away from COVID and say, all right, this is good, and push pause on all of these things and move on to the next thing. Then, if you're not actively working on it, is it going to start to slip?
Well, yes, I think I view it as not something you can just check a box like well-being check, right? It's a process, and sometimes you're further along in the advancing direction, and sometimes you regress, but the constant going back to it and using the practices that um, it's all about cultivating um, a skill set of, there's a lot: gratitude, physical activity, kindness, etc. There are a lot of strategies that you can implement, and when you have your own personalized toolkit, you just keep going back to your toolkit, and sometimes you have to add new things to it, but it's the striving towards
Yeah.
this goal.
Now, if for those of you who are viewing this either right now live or even during the replay, whatever that means, I just say replay to sound hip. But if you're watching this live or not, I would love to know what types of well-being initiatives are being carried out in your organizations, and if you're comfortable, also sharing which types of initiatives work and which types of initiatives may not work so well. I'd be really interested to see that because you mentioned a lot of different things, right? And so many of them sound like the difference between initiatives and programs. Maybe I was just working with somebody who is dealing with a lot of burnout and frustration on their team. And they were asking me about all these different programs. And while all of the programs that they were suggesting sounded great, the one thing that I can't escape is the cynicism piece that comes with burnout, where when you burn out, you start feeling more cynical. That's one of the main symptoms. And also just the general cynicism that we have in the world today. So sometimes when things are really programmed, people look at that as an organizational initiative as opposed to, like, does it really reflect, like you were saying, like gratitude? Like, does that really reflect gratitude as much as just making the effort to say thank you? So could you maybe talk a little bit about that difference between programs and initiatives, and have you found that to be, do you agree or disagree with my assumption that things that are maybe like too programmed are going to be met with cynicism?
So I think, especially in organizations, it's really important to have this be authentic and not performative,
Mm,
right? And I think it's important for leaders to assess and take a data driven approach to see what the needs are of their employees. And so that's really the first thing. And um, you're right. I think if well being is a value in the company, it's going to be woven in different ways at different levels into the culture of the company. And so there may be certain specific programs like, a wellness run or something like that, to support employees with their physical fitness. Um, but if the culture of feedback, if there's a culture of feedback, you can integrate well-being and a kind of positive approach into your organization where it doesn't feel inauthentic or contrived, but it's just woven into what you're already doing. And I think that's a great approach to just modify some of the things that you already have to do within your organization and just create it in a way, or modify it, I guess, in a way that supports your employees' well-being. So feedback is one that certainly comes to mind. Having positive feedback, ongoing feedback, not just from your immediate supervisor, but from your coworkers, from your subordinates, etc. That's a great way to cultivate a sense of kindness and engagement within an organization.
Right. So the more integrated it is into your culture, the more buy-in you'll get maybe through the actual programs, but you can't just rely on the programs alone when it's not authentic or integrated into your culture.
Right. Or if it's not based on the explicit needs of your employees, because we're seeing that a lot, a few years ago with tech companies, they had all of these like frills and thrills. And since the pandemic, those things weren't a part of people's working lives. And now that we're moving out of that space, that's not enough to bring employees back to the office.
Mm-hmm.
Free lunch and, foosball tables is not enough. So you really have to look at what the needs are of your employees. And I don't have a specific answer because every organization is different. But if it's embedded and it's based on those needs, you'll get the buy-in and the engagement.
Great. So yeah, I think that's beautiful. It really does. It's independent to each organization and the needs of their people, and perhaps even just the fact that you start with that point, and start with their feedback and their needs, and you're giving them a voice. I would think that alone would enhance their well-being. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And one thing I'll
yeah,
just add
please.
to that is that if there are if your particular organization has other issues like overwork, understaffing, if your employees are in roles that are misaligned with their strengths and interests, new well-being initiatives are not going to combat those aspects that contribute to burnout. And so taking a data driven approach to seeing what your the current state of your employees' well-being, their job satisfaction, their engagement, and really taking collecting some data and using that information. That's a really smart way to see what's going on first, and
Mhm.
then to adapt your interventions to address those issues.
Great. So, okay, so we're getting into the weeds a lot, but I really wanted to, I guess we could pull back now and get back into the weeds afterwards, but I really want to give you the opportunity to tell your personal story to the extent that you feel comfortable, through this journey that all of us sort of went through, but obviously there were very different journeys within the context of this big, worldwide pandemic. But could you share your origin story? How did you get here? How did you get into IO and with this focus on well being? And how have you been faring through the past, what is it, 3 years now?
2.5.
Feels like
Time
that.
is still warm, right? That's a great question. And I thought about this a little bit. And it's a combination of personal and professional experiences. And it starts really at the beginning of my life. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. And as a child, I remember seeing like profound sadness closely connected to profound joy, right? So I remember attending funerals and everyone's somber and sad. And a couple of hours later, sometimes there's a parade. Certainly there's a repast and there's music and good food and drinks, and people are lively and almost celebrating, right? And that really stuck out to me as I was a child and continued to grow, that there's always a mix, right? There's always like that yin and yang in life, and that we have a lot of choice in what we focus on. And so continuing in that, in college, it was kind of a challenging time for me. I was a psych major and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. But I knew I wanted to study abroad because I had studied French in high school, and that was an experience I really wanted to have. So that happened for me my last semester of college of my senior year. And that happened to have been about a year after my father passed away. And so I was in France grieving, but having being surrounded by, beautiful pastries and scenery. And it was just like
Huh.
this mix of, I'm sad, I'm at kind of a lost place, but I have this really interesting and beautiful experience. How can I maximize it, but still honor my emotions, right?
Wow.
And so that has been kind of a theme in my life, is like finding the balance and making a choice. So my time in France was very pivotal as well because it showed me a different way of life, that felt more balanced, that felt more joyful. And when I returned, I was like, I want to continue to preserve this as much as possible, even while I'm in the US. And that's been a challenge, but it certainly defined my career path. And I devoted the first 12 years of my professional career to working with students to have their own study abroad experiences, or international students, supporting them who are studying here in the US. And maybe like halfway through, I got exposed to Clifton Strengths. And
Mm.
I really love that framework of, what are you good at and how can you be better at that and use that as your tool, like kind of as your superpower to work well, to support other people in your personal life, etc. And so that really sparked my journey of continuing to delve deeply into the well-being space. And the pandemic certainly catalyzed that even more. So in 2020, a few friends and I took the Science of Wellbeing course, like April, and I really listened to how passionate I was about learning all of this stuff. And I listened to that and I continued. And so I signed up for a second master's degree, and I continued to like read everything that I could. And I was like, I want to do more of this for the next phase of my career. And that's pretty much what led me here.
Right. So I was looking up Clifton's strengths because I think a lot of people are not familiar with it, and I think it is incredibly valuable. I did. I've done the Clifton strengths. I've done them for my older kids as well, and Brittany from Gen Elevate is agrees how powerful that is. But I really appreciate your connection between, the sad, the mourning, and also the joy, and it makes me think a lot about this aspect of toxic positivity, right? Where so many of us are so uncomfortable with the idea of negative emotion, and in reality that is a piece of the whole. Have you seen that as something that negatively impacts well-being when we kind of don't accept those negative aspects of our life, or negative feelings in our life rather?
Certainly, I think there's a lot of research about meaning, which is a key part of well being. And typically,
Uh-oh. Looks like Sonia just froze. We'll give her a
meaning,
second.
can you hear me?
Yes, you're back. And in the meantime,
Okay,
I put up Clifton Strengths, Gallup. Check it out.
okay. So I can't remember like where I may have left off, but I was saying that one aspect of well-being is meaning and cultivating that. And a lot of times meaningful experiences are challenging. And to really be able to sit in the challenge and to be as reflective as possible while you're in it, to ask yourself, what am I supposed to learn right now? Why am I having this experience? How can I potentially help someone else in the future by sharing my story and what I learned from this really difficult and challenging experience. And so there's a fine line, and I often try to ask myself, like, am I being toxic? Am I doing toxic positivity right now? Whenever I'm like, okay, this is really bad, but, and so it's a balance. And I think a lot of the toxic positivity comes from other people um, trying to support and help you and say, like, oh, it's not that bad, or think about this. And sometimes, so be mindful of that as you're interacting with people at work or in your personal life, to actually um, listen to their experience and not diminish how they may be feeling. And if there's something you can share to be of support, great. If not, listening is really good. That's enough. And certainly not trying to um, get them to see all of the positive aspects. Like, sometimes that's not the right way to approach it.
Right. So in other words, shifting and saying, well, on the bright side, or you're looking at this all wrong, look at, right, and trying to just twist it to all of the positive, which might exist in tandem with that, with the negative and the anxiety and sadness and fear, etc., right, or anger. But when people are feeling that negativity and then they come to you, especially if you're in a leadership role and they come to you, I always tell
Mhm.
leaders, like, wow, you are doing something right if your people feel comfortable coming to you with that, with that negative emotion. and
Right.
and the second you dismiss it while thinking that you're doing the right thing, you're burning trust. And that person who already felt like they were on a lonely island are now feeling even lonelier and less understood in a lot of ways.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's okay to sit in it, right? But sometimes the only good from a challenging experience is a little bit of wisdom, right? And sometimes there is a lot of good, but you have to kind of move through it to see it, right? So, yeah.
So when you started your IO psychology journey,
Mhm.
what is what did you take away from that? Was there, like, what do you use from that journey um, toward your approach to well-being, because you were already so thoughtful of your own well-being and very uh, cognizant and maybe self-exploratory. But what did you take away from adding this science, this industrial organizational psychology, to that, if anything? I hope something.
Oh, there's so much. I would say for my personal well being, I was already kind of doing this, but I think it just reinforced, is really doing like self data, if you will, like collecting information about my feelings or my energy level, and connecting, okay, I feel excited when this is happening or when I'm with these people, and using that information to do more of the things that make me feel good, and to evaluate how I can either eliminate or minimize the things that make me feel less good, right? And so taking that almost scientific approach of like really noticing what's going on in my life as well as in my um, I guess, inner life as
Yeah.
well. That's certainly an approach. In terms of work, um, I'm not an IO practitioner in my current role in the traditional sense, but I use IO techniques all the time. When I meet with colleagues to get an understanding of how we're going to collaborate, asking really, really good questions to get a full picture of the situation, what the needs are, and using that to decide what intervention will be most appropriate and successful. So just using that data driven approach has definitely been a huge takeaway from my IO training.
Yeah. So and I would argue that that's definitely an IO role. It's the It's the way you think about these problems and approach these problems that I think is adds so much value and is so important. We have a question here. Um, do you think that an employee who is able to voice negative emotions is also more free to be creative and bring up most innovate or more innovative ideas at work as well? Is there a connection there?
That's a good question. I would think if an employee feels empowered to voice, negative, not only emotions, but negative feedback or critique of an initiative that's occurring at work, that they probably also have the freedom to innovate and use that creativity to design a new program or initiative in the workplace. So I think there certainly could be a correlation there. And I think it's important for organizations, if one person feels empowered to do that, to really um, have a culture where all employees have that same feeling of, you know what, I saw this, I have, let me question this, or let me provide a critical feedback of this, and everyone has that same equal ability to share their voice. I think that's the important part.
Yeah, and I would just add that you know, I think there are studies out there that show that positive emotion is more highly correlated to creativity on its own, but negative emotion is correlated with more critical thinking. I don't want my doctor to be such an optimist that he looks at some weird growth on my back and says, "You look great." You know, like I'm sure that's nothing. I want my doctor to be critical. I want my lawyer to be critical when reading over contracts for me. And like Sonia said, when you're looking um, at using critical thought and voicing negative thought or negative emotion or critical thought in terms of giving feedback and being a devil's advocate sometimes and being that critical voice, I think on a team we know that, you know, when we're all super positive and getting along, we don't have as much creativity as when we're you know, voicing our concerns. So I think it's kind of a complex thing, but I think there's space for it, and absolutely. Um, so so now you're in the IO an IO master's program. See how I say the I've got a little bit of a bias there. The IO master. You're in an IO master's program. You're working a full time job. You've got stuff going on at home. You know where you're wearing multiple hats. So um, at this point, you're a pro, right? So no issue. Is that right?
No, not at all. So the year of 2020 was looked very different for me compared to last year, 2021. And 2020, I think a theme would have just been kind of cultivating the soil. Like I had a lot of freedom and space and time to focus solely on my well-being, and I was building up some resilience that I definitely needed last year, and I didn't know it until it sprung on me. But essentially, in 2021, um, I became a caregiver to my mom as her only child.
Hmm.
um, the workplace also became more stressful as I became um, a team of one when there's typically teams of three or four on that immediate sub team.
Wow.
And I was navigating this graduate program and, still in the pandemic. And so there was a lot of role conflict, a lot of challenges and learning new things. And my well-being personally took a dip, and I struggled with that, and it really took a lot of practice, a lot of talking to other people and leaning on them for support and encouragement. our the cohort that I was in for the master's program was a huge part of that. So thank you all. And I think we all, it was just a mutual understanding that everyone was going through something or multiple things during that year, but we all were committed to finishing the degree program, and we all supported each other in so many different ways as we were learning together and navigating our personal lives. So yeah, that's how the last year has been. um, and I took that time really to do that self science and think about, like, okay, what are my greatest stressors and how can I mitigate them,
Mhm.
and how can I eliminate the ones that are not meaningful to me any longer. And that was a process, and I'm happy that I'm moving on the other side. I'm on the other side, but there's still some, some healing and growing that still needs to be done. But kind of going back to what we've been talking about, that duality of, like, there's a lot of stress and negative there, but there's also a lot of good and meaning and things to be grateful for. So how can I focus on that and use that energy that I get from that to navigate all of the challenging aspects that I'm navigating?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the support, because it is such an important piece in that well-being, just to have that support system somewhere, right? And it's really
Mhm.
helpful if it's your manager and your coworkers, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it comes from outside. We have in August, we're going to be interviewing Amber Fields, who started um, uh, Blacks in UX. Uh, uh, I forget the exact title of her organization, but it brings all of these Black UX professionals from all throughout, different organizations, and brings them together. So when she was looking for support, she reached outside of her organization, and
Mhm.
when she wasn't necessarily finding it in her organization. And the fact that you were in this program and you found this group, which I was always envious of, that the amount of community, the sense of community and support that was in this group of people who were experiencing something very unique, being mostly fully employed while in a master's program that started right at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And like that, I mean, that type of support was so critical. But when you went on to talk about your process of stepping back and identifying the stressors and then prioritizing them, and thinking about what was most important, and then you said, and then you thought of how can I mitigate them.
Mhm.
So a lot of times when I'm speaking with people, they tell me, yeah, I've got so much on my plate, and I say, well, what is the most important and urgent? And their response is all of it.
Mhm.
And so I can imagine that you're looking at this and thinking the same thing. You got to take care of your parent. You got to take care of. You got to bring in the money. You're
Mhm.
invested in this master's program. So what did mitigation look like, either specifically or generally, if specifically is a little uncomfortable to talk about?
Um, so I would say, in terms of mitigating the caregiving, um, that was really challenging because, as I mentioned, I'm an only child, but we have good friends, right? And so either, asking for support there, or finding little hacks in our daily routine. Um, it was just an ongoing process to try to mitigate that. But I was committed and I am committed to that because it's urgent, important, and meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that, you mentioned urgent and important, but I want to add
Yeah.
meaningful to it as well. And so that was kind of the lens and the criteria that I went through. And so in terms of my work environment, I really thought about, my well-being, my job satisfaction, how engaged I felt in my future. And over time, I it was clear to me that it was time to pivot. That I had a 12-year career in this aspect of higher ed, and it was time to move on. And so it was just by noticing different aspects, I made a commitment to pivot, and to find employment that was more aligned to this new career interest that I had been honing towards.
Hmm.
And that was a good decision, because when I transitioned, I felt my well-being improved significantly.
Yeah.
Um, and the program, I knew it had an expiration date, right? And so,
Right.
like, having an end in sight was actually just helpful for me to um, keep the temporary nature of that aspect of stress
Hmm.
um, in focus, and just say, like, this is the date. If can get to this date, then this will no longer be one of the components.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I love that idea of the finish line. Um,
mhm.
I was, I think, 70 or 80 pounds overweight when I decided to run a marathon. And I thought that training for a marathon would, shed the pounds. But I had never been hungrier before in my life. And so I used it as an excuse to just eat whatever I wanted. So I was 180 pounds or 80 pounds overweight, well over 180, running a marathon. It was the most painful thing in my life. But there was the finish line. And Val on YouTube asked about what is the ideology from Clifton Strengths relating to work burnout. And I don't know if you're familiar with this or have any ideas. Personally, I don't know Clifton Strengths enough, but I think my number one is futuristic,
Okay.
and then number two is optimistic or something. And I find the futuristic piece is that whatever I'm going through today, I'm looking
Mhm.
toward the future. But I don't know how much that would protect one from burnout because burnout is that change, right? It's a change
Mhm.
toward cynicism and it's a
Right.
change toward overwhelm. So I don't know that anybody's completely safe from it. What are your thoughts on this?
So, Clifton Strengths, the first thing is to really discover what your strengths are. And you can take the assessment. There are other assessments, but they're not paying me, but I really love this model. And so once we know our strengths, the goal is to find work that gives us opportunities to use them consistently in different ways within our role, but you also use your strengths outside of work, right? And so I think what how there might be a relation is, if you are in a role that's misaligned with your strengths, that's misaligned with your interests, that's misaligned with your values as well, that can contribute to burnout, right? And so, one technique is to go back to knowing your strengths and to find ways to adapt your role if there's flexibility, even if you can change um, your role to create 10 or 15% to do activities um, where you actually utilize your strengths and contribute that to your organizations. That can um, mitigate burnout. But I would say that if you do that and you are still suffering from burnout and you're not receiving the support of your organization, um, maybe it's time to research other employment. And that's, a lot of people are doing that. That's why we're having this great resignation or reshuffling, or whatever we want to call it, because I think people have become more aware of what their values are, or of wanting to have a sense of joy and engagement in the workplace, and using what we're good at, doing what we're good at to do good in the world, right? And so if you're not feeling that, it's okay to take a deliberative approach to finding new, more aligned employment.
Yeah, that's so two things. One is the idea that people are more aware of their values and what they want and where they can find meaning, are they more aware or less? To me, it seems like people are more aware of what's not filling their bucket, right? So like, and still sort of feeling lost in a way, as you see the Great Resignation with people leaving jobs and then hopping into new careers or jobs and then not being satisfied there.
Right.
You see all sorts of church, synagogue, mosque attendance down, right? People are becoming less religious generally, and so it's like this movement away from the things that we used to find meaning in. But what are we moving? What are we moving toward? Right, right, and like, how much does the organization have this responsibility to help us find that within the organization, and how much of the responsibility falls on us? I guess that's a lot of follow-up questions, but maybe that piece, like, where do we play into this? You got your organization, who you're doing this within academia, also as a practitioner trying to help organizations with this, but then you know you're talking about your own journey and about the things that you had to do, right? You had to go seek all of this support, and it wasn't necessarily within your organization that you found that support. So where is the responsibility for all of this? Where does it lie, and who's got the power here?
Wow, that's a big question, and I think it's a both and, right? As individuals, we have responsibility in cultivating our own sense of joy and well-being, because work is just one component of our
Right.
lives, right? And so, but it's a big contributor to um, feeling well and thrive, like you're thriving in life. And it can also create, it could be a big contributor to burnout and other negative impacts, right? And so I do agree that the organization does have some responsibility, because one selfish aspect of it for an organization is, if your employees are well, if they are happy and they feel good about their lives holistically, they're going to support your organization in a way that produces excellent business results. So that's one way to frame it. But, taking a more humanistic approach, we talk a lot about people bringing their whole authentic selves to work. And, you know, what does that look like for each individual? I think there should be certainly flexibility, because I don't bring my whole authentic self in every space that I navigate. But we, it's there, you may not know what's going on, or, my, in my particular situation, I told enough for my employers to know, like, hey, I'm navigating this, but I wasn't parading my pain, right? And so if I show up ready to work and I'm there fully, that does not mean that there aren't underlying things that I wasn't dealing with. And I think in organization and leaderships and manager, etc., they have to provide um, resources and services as a part of like a holistic benefits package, if you will, to support their employees in that way. So that could be anything from having EAP healthcare that includes mental health services, to maybe having coaching sessions available for people who are okay but they want to like progress a little bit more. That could be having opportunities to connect authentically with each other, especially when we're working in hybrid and remote activities. Social connection is vital for our well-being, right? And so how can we connect in strategic ways with our coworkers to have a team culture, to bounce off ideas and innovate? That's important. Another aspect is, sometimes people can lose a sense of meaning in what they're doing because they don't know like the outcome of like, the grind. So what are ways that you can connect your employees to your customers or your stakeholders to hear like, hey, by doing this project, this is the outcome that it took, and so those aspects are important, and organizations absolutely have a responsibility to support their employees in this domain, but it might look different than you are thinking.
Right. Yeah, and I love that marriage between the two, and that piece that you spoke about reaching out and sort of asserting yourself and uh, really advocating for yourself. We first met in the role of, I was in the professor role, right? And
Mhm.
while you and other students would come to me with concerns about things that were happening, it was like there were always a couple people who told me their whole life story and really dove in. But that shouldn't be your responsibility to, start crying and pouring all this onto me. And what, like, I'd be fine with it, but that that takes a lot of um, vulnerability that's not necessary or shouldn't be necessary. But I found that in my role as professor, I had to read between the lines. When somebody came
Mhm.
to me and said, things, I really need an extension on this. Things are really hectic right now. And just think, worst case scenario, what does hectic mean?
Mhm.
And be as accommodating as I could. Um, Oftentimes as leaders we don't read between the lines because we just expect the person to come to us with the full story.
Mhm. and and I think that expectation is certainly like an infringement on someone's privacy,
Yeah.
right? um so I think it's important to like, I rarely suggest assuming anything, but I think a good assumption that we all should take in the workplace and personally is that people may no, people are probably navigating some challenge that you cannot see or that you don't know about it. So, giving them a sense of grace, a sense of patience, a sense of trust. If someone's saying, I need an extension, not digging because it's a couple days, like if they're asking, they really need it. And you don't, you don't necessarily need to know why.
Yeah.
And I think that is certainly, I've seen this evolve since the pandemic, where there's a little bit more sensitivity and emotional intelligence and collective grace that we're giving each other. And if I were to change my answer from this 6 and 60, I would say that, like, giving each other a little more grace.
Hmm. Yeah, and that in my many roles, whether management or as a professor or whatnot, when I when I get the rare person who texts me a picture of their flat tire or of their positive COVID test or whatnot, what immediately goes through my mind is, oh my God, this poor person can't imagine the toxic workplaces they've been in,
Right.
that they think that they have to just, provide the proof right off the
Hmm.
bat. Because I certainly don't need that, and nobody should require that best case scenario. Um,
Right.
so I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to do two things. One thing, I wanted to circle back and just restate what you said earlier that I sort of brushed past, and I regret that because it was beautiful. When you were asked about the Clifton strengths and which strengths best align with, that positive emotion or relate to work burnout was the question, right? And the fact that you answered that it's not about your strengths, your specific strengths, or what you get on the disc assessment or Hogan or whatever it is. It's not, who cares what your specific personality is. It's no one personality or one set of strengths or whatever. It's about alignment. I think that's so beautiful. And I think when um, Michelle talks about, who's a past guest, amazing. Michelle helps people as they retire. as they retire from work, find sort of meaning in this pathway in all, and well-being in all regards. But when Michelle talks about this, what are we moving toward? I think so much of it is about that alignment piece that you just spoke to, right? It's like, let's get to know ourselves and find alignment in whatever we do, inside or outside of the workplace. But I did, as a final question that I wanted to tackle here, you refer to yourself sometimes as a womanist well-being practitioner. And I know this is not a topic that we can like tackle super quick, so we'll have to have you back for round two. This has been amazing. But what does that mean, first of all? And second of all, how does well-being impact us differently depending on our intersectionality, and is there a lack of equity in this space of well-being? That's a lot of deep questions. So you answer how you want and tell me what you're gonna share with us next time as well.
So that is a pretty loaded question, and I think the answer would be much longer than the few minutes we have remaining. But womanism is a perspective that was developed by Alice Walker, and I was first exposed to it when I was doing my first master's back in 2014. And while feminism is a part of it, it's really it's originated in the Black woman's experience, and it has less of a political stance, but it's really based on collective liberation and joy for ourselves and other people. Like my well-being is important to me, but it's not just for me. If I learn something that works for me, I want to share it with other people so that they can find ways to adapt whatever I'm sharing to their own life and experience to liberate themselves, transform themselves, and strive towards that goal of well-being. And so that's the perspective that I use. I could, it would take much longer to continue to delve into it, but that's the perspective that I use.
I love that. So it is sort of this communal responsibility for each other
Mm-hmm.
to help, and that which goes back to that conversation about how much is it the organization and how much it is the individual, and the truth is it is all of us collectively. I think that that's a beautiful idea, and I'm looking forward to learning more. So if people want to learn more before we can schedule you to come, are you going to come back? Was this as scary as you
Sure,
thought it
I'd
would
love
be?
to. I'd love to.
Okay, awesome. Then we're definitely going to schedule that. But in the meantime, if somebody wants to learn more about you, I know we've got a QR code there that goes to your like wonderfully like well thought out and written blog. It's really deep stuff, and I think it's absolutely a must for people to visit that. And if anybody hovers their phone above that screen, oh, I can't reach into your screen. That would be weird, right? If I could. But if anybody wants to hover over that QR code with their camera open, they could just hit the link. If you want to reach out to me, you can hit my QR code. But that right above Sonia's head, that will get you to her blog. In addition, connect with her on LinkedIn. Yes, right?
Yes,
Unless
please.
unless you're trying to sell her something, please connect with Sonia on LinkedIn. Thank you, Philip. Thank you all for adding to the conversation today. And I want to thank Sonia, but I'm going to come right back to you in 2 weeks from now. Water Cooler Wednesday Summer Edition is coming to you every 2 weeks, every other Wednesday. But we are going to be having a conversation with Tammy Trollo. This is an unapologetically candid discussion about DEI. I am extremely excited and nervous and scared to death of this conversation because it's already a very hot button issue. And what I love about Tammy is that she talks about these really even the most controversial aspects of this conversation with complete candor. and bravery, and that's something that I wish I had more in me. So you're not going to want to miss that conversation, and please join and ask her the hard questions that I might be too scared to ask her. There's nothing that will phase her, I don't think, in terms of the questions. But that's in 2 weeks, and we hope to see you there. But Sonya, this has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm so happy, that you were able to get your message out a little bit further to more people in that womanistic sense, right? Where you're helping you're not just working through your own well-being, but helping the community at large. And I really appreciate you being here to do that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And I want to just take a quick moment to thank my dear friend Mashari for coming to the rescue when my power was out to let me come over to her place to have this conversation with you. It's been great. Thank you.
That is awesome, and sums up like really my takeaway from this, which is alignment with Clifton's strengths, etc., but also the sense of community responsibility for each other and support for each other. When your power goes out in this crazy storm that we had here in the Baltimore, D.C., Virginia area last night, and your power goes off right before the interview, that's having a friend that you can just move in and broadcast from there is pretty special. So thank you all for tuning in. And I will see you in 2 weeks.